Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. So a slight change in location because my housemate who lives next door to me just came back from holiday. She's very sleepy, so I thought, I'm not going to be the horrible person who like an hour after she gets back and goes to bed suddenly just drops into my own room and starts doing a video. I'm not that mean. So we've relocated to down here. I'm sorry, we are at a slightly awkward angle because I didn't want to have to rearrange my tripod too much, because I know that the second that I try and change it back, it'll be such a nightmare. So I'm having to look up from down below at you. But I wanted to come back to talk about Jane Eyre. But as you know, over the past few months, I have been looking back at my old favourite books of the year, going from 2014 all the way up to 2019, since those were the years that I wasn't on BookTube, with the grand ambition being that I would eventually go through the top of each of those lists, reread them, and then work out which of those books are my favourite books of all time. And now that I've finished all of those favourites videos, I'm now actually undergoing that process. And I most recently did this with Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, as well as The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, partially because it is Victober, partially because, it's that kind of time of year. I feel like autumn time is really Bronte season, but basically I was just really in the mood for a bit of Bronte. I listened to the audiobooks for both of these back to back, really enjoyed the process. I did want to come here originally to talk about both books, but I think what has become very clear is that despite the fact that I love both of these books, there is a clear winner in terms of which of these books is a favourite of all time. And I think it's just because of the fact that even though it's been a couple of days since I finished reading it or re-listening to it, I can't stop thinking about it. And that is Jane Eyre. I do love Tenant of Wildfell Hall. I would still say that it is like my second favourite Bronte book so far of the ones I have read. But I want to reserve like my all-time favourites list for those books that basically have become my personality, that I can't stop thinking about, that the themes, the characters just reverberate in my head. And for me, it does have to be Jane Eyre. And Jane Eyre has been a really interesting one to go back and reread. The first time that I read Jane Eyre was when I was about 18 years old. It was almost 10 years ago. It was the beginning of 2014. When I was first getting back into reading. I did know vaguely the story of Jane Eyre through the 2011 movie with Michael Fassbender and Mia Wasikowska. I generally knew the plot, I knew the characters, but a lot of my ideas of like the themes and the vibe and atmosphere came from that movie. And I think it's a very stunning movie, but is very cinematic. I've not yet seen the BBC Jane Eyre, though I do own it and I do plan on watching it, hopefully this month. But when I think about that film and I think about the first time that I read Jane Eyre, it was very much with this idea of melodrama, of the gothic, this very eerie atmosphere in mind. And I think that very much coloured my view of this book while reading it. Whereas rereading it, for me, I feel like popular depictions of Jane Eyre and like the popular culture consciousness of Jane Eyre has really influenced how many people see this book, and just generally the Brontes in general. Because when I was reading it, I was struck by actually how grounded this book feels for me. There are eerie moments, there are hints of like this gothic nature, but for me they were few and far between. Everything else felt very true to life. There are a couple of slightly more fantastical moments towards the end of the book, or really one in particular, but the rest of it just feels like how people would generally act for me. I really found myself appreciating the character of Jane Eyre even more than I had before, and I think in comparison to pop culture depictions of her, Jane is actually much more spirited and much more lively than I think pop culture tends to depict her. I feel like I often think of Jane Eyre and I think of somebody who's very solemn, very serious, and actually rereading her, I don't think she's like that at all. Instead, I see her as somebody who is very pragmatic and principled and passionate, all of the P's. She is somebody who desperately, throughout the course of the book, wants two things. She wants freedom and she wants love, and receives very little of either. I love the way that she seems to observe the world through the books that she consumes. Right from the beginning, she's depicting her cousin John Reed as being like a Nero figure, and throughout the books there'll be these little literary allusions which really inform her worldview, as well as just gently demonstrating how passionate a person she is. I love that reading is such a massive part of this book, even in little indirect ways. At the beginning of the book, we see her turning to books for comfort, even though it doesn't last for too long, right up until the last chapter, which reminds us very clearly that Jane is seeing us as readers. Reader, I married him, and maybe is hoping that we're going to find a little bit of comfort and intrigue in what we're reading. I find it interesting to note that Jane is not as solitary and lonely a figure as I'd often pictured her. Jane is definitely somebody who is very much mistreated by the world, but she's not as dejected as I think I saw her in my mind. There are definitely people throughout the course of the book who do try to help her. The issue with this is that they are not the people who are in charge and who have real world power to really materialize really change her circumstances. But throughout the books, there are people who show Jane kindness. Bessie the maid, Helen Burns, the teachers at Lowood, her uncle in Madeira, who has very little means of being able to contact her, but is eventually able to provide her a way out and financial freedom. And I think these people really show Jane that she is not immune from being able to receive kindness. She is not somebody who is inherently unlovable. And it probably strengthens her resolve that she is deserving of this, that she can be treated better and that she should be. And I think that is a resolve that carries throughout the rest of the book. And yeah, speaking of Lowood, I think, once again, popular depiction of the school that Jane Eyre goes to is that it is an entirely barren, unfeeling place, full of religious intolerance, full of harsh treatment. But actually, when you look more into this story, the majority of the teachers at Lowood are generally just trying to do their best by their students. They do want to show kindness to their students, but they have a limited amount of supplies and funds, and it's characters like Mr. Brocklehurst, supervisors who don't actually have much to do with the day-to-day running of the school, that are really the negative influences. Mr. Brocklehurst is so keen on showing to other people, showcasing this school as an example of like his piety and treating it like this vanity project. But the teachers and students alike all despise him and deplore his treatment. And when there is an opportunity to actually improve the lot of the students, obviously it takes a horrendous amount of death and illness in order to facilitate this. Then the school is actually able to function as a school. That's not to do with the internal forces, it's very much to do with the external forces of the people with power who just don't care. And once again, that is the theme that runs throughout the book. And yeah, the main theme that struck me through this reread of Jane Eyre was this idea of freedom and Jane's constant striving to get some sort of freedom for herself. But not only that, but to be able to give freedom to others when she has some for herself. I found it very notable that her first act upon actually receiving an inheritance and an amount of money that would actually change her life, her first instinct is to share it. She thinks nothing of sharing it with her family, with her newly found cousins, so that they may have some freedom of their own. And yeah, I just feel like Jane Eyre is one that I am going to keep on going back to and finding more things to enjoy. As I say, when I first read this book at age 18, I was thinking about this book in terms of its atmosphere, trying to draw out this gothic atmosphere and melodrama, and I was thinking very much of the romance. This time around, I'm thinking more about this main character and her quest for freedom and her voice heard regardless of her situation. Now I'm reading the romance between Jane and Rochester as one of two people who, like, mentally are equals, but because of their station are not. And that is something that they're constantly coming up against, or at least Jane is very much coming up against. I feel like Mr. Rochester doesn't really care so much. At the same time, I can definitely see her attraction to him, for the simple fact of this very passionate, very spirited yearning for freedom, but also yearning for love and for somebody who actually sees her and understands her. Of course, the first time that she comes across this, she's probably going to fall in love with this man. Jane responds to people who truly see her, not people who try to fit their own image of perfection onto her, which is probably why her relationship with St. John Rivers ends up being unsuccessful. Not related to my reading of this, but I recently discovered, actually through this reread, that despite all of the popular depictions I have seen of Jane Eyre being very faithful to like an early Victorian style, actually I believe that Jane Eyre is set more in a Regency period, or at least in the early 1800s. I saw online that Jane is actually born in 1789 as per the narrative, which means that the bulk of the story is taking place between like 1800 to 1809. She marries Rochester in 1809. When she's writing the book, it's 1819, which means, like, surely in all of our period dramas that are based on Jane Eyre, everyone should be wearing Regency garb. Like, can anybody point me to an adaptation of Jane Eyre where they're all wearing like Regency Empire waistlines? Because I want to see that. In terms of this general favourite reread, what I learned about my personal enjoyment in reading, obviously both Tenant of Wildfell Hall and Jane Eyre are books that I absolutely love, but what makes Jane Eyre just that little bit above, what gives it the edge? I know from reading this that I do generally like a quiet book, in the sense that that I love the Brontes, that I love Austen, and a lot of the time people, particularly people who are into more fast-paced adventure books, criticise for, basically being books where the majority of the plot takes place in one central location, where it's basically people going to each other's houses and not much more. However, in comparing my love of Jane Eyre to my love of Tenant of Wildfell Hall, maybe what I'm discovering is that, yes, I like some quietness. I don't mind if a book is fairly slow to medium paced and things are a little bit more contained, but I do generally like the pace to be ever so slightly dialed up. While I love both Tenant and Jane Eyre, I suppose I do like a little bit more plot and a little bit more melodrama. Both of Anne Bronte's books tend to be that little bit more grounded and realistic, whereas Jane Eyre has that little bit of flair for melodrama. And I do like a little bit of that. A comparison that I did in my mind is that Tenant of Wildfell Hall is to Jane Eyre what Persuasion is to Pride and Prejudice. Overall, all four books are fairly quiet in the grand scheme of literature, but I would say that Pride and Prejudice and Jane Eyre have like a little bit more going on in their plots, whereas Tenant of Wildfell Hall and Persuasion are kind of like slow simmers before everything seems things to happen at the end. And it's not a case that either one are superior to the other, it's just a case of personal taste. But I like the fact that Jane Eyre does seem to have iconic moments happening throughout the entire book, rather than this slow build-up. I also like the fact that Jane Eyre is not a perfect book, particularly by modern standards. There are definitely things that you can criticise about it, the ways that there are Victorian sensibilities that do not hold up today. You know, there are discussions in here about missionaries, about empire, and there's an amount of clumsiness in discussion about slavery that can be a little bit hard to stomach. The relationship between Jane and Rochester is definitely like a bit of a Marmite one. But I actually do like the fact that we can have these conversations. I like the fact that it's not perfect, because it just means that there is more to discuss. And also I feel quite safe in having those conversations, because I don't feel like Charlotte Bronte was writing from a perspective of wanting to be malicious on any of these topics. I think she is just writing as a very sheltered Victorian woman who does not have like a sense of the scale and scope that we do on these topics. And even saying that, there's definitely much about Victorian sensibilities that I'm never going to understand as a modern woman. And in my slight comparison of Tenant to Jane Eyre, you know, I think overall what is going to make a book a favourite of all time, as opposed to a book that I generally just really love but doesn't quite hit that upper echelon, is my emotional reaction. I found myself constantly through the process of Jane Eyre wanting to go back to it. When I was having to do work, instead of listening to Jane Eyre, I was just like, when? Whereas Tenant of Wildfell Hall, it's a fantastic book. I do think it's brilliant. I recommend it to anybody, but I didn't have that same pull. And I do think a lot has to be said about that personal reaction. So there we go. Those are all of my very incomplete thoughts of my rereads of Jane Eyre. I think this has been a really nice exercise in rereading, re-listening, and has been a nice starter in starting that process of going back over all of these old favourites. I think it might actually be quite nice to do it in a similar way, where I'm reading like two of these favourites back to back that are quite similar to each other. You know, I can probably do like Pride and Prejudice and Emma back to back, as well as some others. Not necessarily because I'm wanting to compare them like it's some sort of sports bracket, because I don't actually think that's a perfect way of working out which books are favourites, but I think it can really help to inform me on my personal opinions. You know, it's slight comparison as opposed to, you know, all out war. Do let me know any of your thoughts about Jane Eyre and Tenant of Wildfell Hall. I know that people's favourite Bronte books is a very hot discussion, and particularly during Victober. I know that I didn't say everything that I could have said about Jane Eyre. These were just the things that really struck me this time round reading, and hopefully in future rereads I can have more to discuss. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.